Though there are dozens of tales told in the storied history of J.R.R. Tolkien's legendarium, without a doubt the most well-known is his chronicle of the War of the Ring in his Lord of the Rings trilogy. As the name implies, the main conflict explored in that story revolves around a ring of power. Simply called the One Ring, it became the focus of multiple wars throughout the Second and Third Ages of Middle-earth. However, as the title Lord of the Rings implies, there are other rings of power, ones that are not as well explored by pop culture adaptations of the legendarium. They are nevertheless interesting and important components to the world, with far-reaching consequences that touch every part of the Middle-earth we see in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. It is no exaggeration to say that these rings shaped everything about Tolkien's world. So, here is everything you need to know about the other 19 Rings of Power. Quickly, before we get started, if you enjoy what you're seeing here, please shoot this video a like and subscribe for more in the future. And if you really want to help the channel out, you can ring the bell to get notifications every time I upload. A day may come where we don't have to beg you to do that as YouTubers, but it is not this day. Alright, let's get started. During the Second Age of Middle-earth, long before the War of the Ring, as Sauron grew in power and carved a kingdom into Mordor, he took upon himself the disguise of Anatar, the Lord of Gifts. Under this name, Sauron sowed many dark seeds that would cause pain and ruin throughout Middle-earth. One of the most dangerous products of Anatar's deceit, however, was the creation of 20 Rings of Power. Around the year 1200 of the Second Age, Anatar befriended the Gwaith Ymir Dain, or the people of the Jewelsmiths, a powerful guild of elven craftsmen, claiming to be an agent of the Holy Valar. Masters of their craft, and with a thirst to further their knowledge, the Jewelsmiths welcomed Anatar and his wisdom. In particular, the Jewelsmith Celebrimbor took influence from the Lord of Gifts, incorporating his teachings into the creation of a series of magical rings. Many of these were lesser items, infused with just simple effects. These were essays, forged by the Elves in study of the craft. By the year 1500 of the Second Age, 300 years after Anatar first introduced himself, he led the sufficiently skilled jewelsmiths in the construction of the Greater Rings. The primary benefits bestowed by these Greater Rings was to prevent decay and change, to preserve what the bearer holds most dear. To the Elves, this meant preserving their lands and drawing from their beauty. This effect extended to the ring bearer as well, extending their lives to the point of immortality by halting their aging. The rings would also enhance a wearer's natural powers and abilities, to the effect of basically allotting magical power. Each of these rings could look after themselves, as explained by Gandalf the Grey. Most of them had something of their own spirit, their own will that it could compel a wearer to enact. When in possession of a ring bearer found themselves unable to abandon it, though a ring could decide to abandon its bearer. Additionally, most of the rings could tap into the world of the unseen, though to different degrees. One of the rings could shift those who bore it completely into the spirit world, while many others could render those who wore them invisible. In total between them, Celebrimbor and Anatar crafted 20 of these Rings of Power. Together, they made 16. Celebrimbor alone forged 3, and in secret, Sauron made a final ring to rule all the others. This was done in the heart of Sauron's domain, at the fires of Mount Doom in the year 1600 of the Second Age, 100 years after the creation of the others. The Dark Lord poured much of himself, his power and soul, into the One Ring, speaking dark spells in its manufacture to bind the others to his will. The Elves heard these spells, and it was known they were betrayed. In their wisdom, they refused to use any of the Greater Rings, and Sauron marched upon their lands, bringing war to claim them. In this campaign, Celebrimbor was slain, and 9 of the Greater Rings he had crafted with Anatar were captured by the Dark Lord. Sauron sought out men with evil hearts and presented them with these 9 rings. 1 was an Easterling, and 3 Númenóreans. The nationality of the others is unknown. On the hands of these men, the rings brought great power, and the 9 bearers were quickly raised to kings and sorcerers, though ultimately the gifts brought upon by the rings were betrayals. Yes, they granted immortality, but the 9 were quickly exhausted and eventually faded from the world of the living. They were condemned to walk as wraiths, and over the next 550 years, one by one, forced into the servitude of Sauron as the Nazgul. Even the rings were inevitably stripped from the wraiths, taken by Sauron to enhance his own power, though their ultimate fate is not known to us. Before the Dark Lord's betrayal of the Elves, the Dwarves were presented with 7 rings, one for each of the 7 great dwarf clans that we learn of: the Firebeards, the Broadbeams, the Iron Fists, the Stiffbeards, the Blacklocks, the Stonefoots, and Durin's Folk. It isn't entirely clear whether or not the presentation of the rings was the division of these factions, or if they existed beforehand and were merely strengthened by the Dark Lord's tainted gifts. Regardless, coming into possession of these rings of power surely solidified the power structure within the clans. The traditions of Durin's Folk say that he received his ring from the elven smith Celebrimbor. It is likely that the others were presented with theirs as similar gifts. Despite these rings being made as part of the 16 under the Dark Lord's influence, Sauron was unable to enforce his will upon the Dwarven Lords. In fact, the magic infused within the rings did little for the dwarves, not even granting them invisibility when worn. They were also mostly immune to the detrimental effects of the rings, though they greatly magnified the greed and anger of those that bore them. Given the natural tenacity and stubbornness of even a common dwarf, and the fact that only the most powerful Dwarven Lords were gifted with the rings, it is clear to see how they resisted submission to Sauron's bidding. It is also assumed that the rings gave those that wielded them a vastly increased lifespan, as, like the men, the dwarves presumably could not age while wearing the rings. It is also whispered that the power of the rings could multiply whatever was mined in the Dwarven kingdoms. However, it was the greed sown by the rings that ultimately led to the ruin of the Dwarven ringbearers and brought about horrible evils that benefited Sauron. In practice, the Dwarven Lords used their rings to amass great hoards of treasure, the likes of which passed into fable and legend. These collections of gold and jewels would also in turn catch the attraction of dragons, like Smaug the Golden. This drake claimed the Lonely Mountain as his roost, capturing all of the treasure within and causing the downfall of Thror, the king under the mountain. In the end, dragons consumed 4 of the Dwarven rings, either by their fire or through their stomachs. The result was the same either way: destruction. The other 3 were reacquired by Sauron, including the mightiest of the 7 originally given to Durin. This ring was passed through all of Durin's heirs, eventually making its way into the possession of Thrain, son of Thror and father of Thorin Oakenshield, after his capture and torture at the hands of the Dark Lord in disguise as the Necromancer. Sauron's own greed and insatiable desire to find the One Ring eventually led the Dark Lord to send envoys to approach Dain II, king under the Lonely Mountain. He offered to return the 3 survivors of the 7 rings if the dwarves lent aid in recovering the One Ring, though Dain refused, knowing Sauron to be untrustworthy. The final of the greater rings were 3 crafted by Celebrimbor alone. Because of this, those that wore them were free of the passive effects of the Dark Lord's corrupting influence, whilst benefiting from many of the other boons brought by their enchantment. When worn, these rings could not grant invisibility, though the rings themselves were hidden from all except other ring-bearers. Each also bequeathed their own unique effects, and a wearer could choose to pass along or surrender a ring without difficulty. However, the elven smith had used Anatar's teaching in the planning of these rings, so they could be touched by Sauron's far-reaching words but not fully bent to his dark will. Still, after Sauron spoke the Black Tongue to empower the One Ring, the elves heard of his betrayal, removing the 3 rings and hiding them. In a fury, Sauron demanded that the rings be passed to him, for they would not have even been made without his teachings. When refused, the Dark Lord marched upon the elven kingdom of a region, seeking the rings, but they were spirited away before a region fell. Upon Sauron's defeat during the War of the Last Alliance, the confidence of the Elven Lords was renewed, and the 3 were once again brought into service. As magic faded from the world, the elves used the influence of the rings to keep their lands pristine and unstained, even as other lands grew into disrepair. The first of these 3 was Ninya, the Ring of Water, forged from mithril and set with a white stone. Celebrimbor left Ninya in the care of Lady Galadriel and Lothlorien. Ninya was infused with additional properties, allowing its bearer to protect, preserve, and conceal their subjects from evil. The second was Nuria, the Ring of Fire, crafted from gold and set with a ruby. Celebrimbor passed the red ring to the Elven Lord and shipwright Círdan and Lindon in the Grey Havens. Later, when meeting with Gandalf the Grey, Círdan saw deep into the wizard's future and knew his labors would be many, and gifted Gandalf with Nuria so that they may be easier. As Círdan explained to Gandalf, the Ring of Fire allowed its bearer to kindle passion in their followers, inspiring courage within them beyond what they may normally find. The final and most powerful of the three rings was Vilya, the Ring of Air, made with gold and set with a sapphire. Celebrimbor gifted Vilya to Gil-galad of the Grey Havens, though it was passed to Elrond of Rivendell before Gil-galad's death during the War of the Last Alliance. It is not entirely clear what powers exactly Vilya bestowed, but Elrond was known to be exceedingly wise and just, and a gifted healer. These were perhaps abilities granted or enhanced by the Blue Ring. When the One Ring was destroyed and Sauron with it, the power drained from the three rings, leaving them ordinary if beautiful relics. They sailed across the western seas along with Galadriel, Gandalf, and Elrond when the Elves left Middle-earth for the Undying Lands. There is more to the One Ring than what time currently allows us to discuss. That is a subject deserving of its own piece, and it will get one. I do not want to skirt over its importance at the end of a discussion of all the rings it was meant to dominate. Nevertheless, the other rings of power are massively important parts of Tolkien's legendarium that are usually neglected in the mainstream adaptations of the franchise. This isn't entirely unsurprising, given that the storylines explored in the live-action and video game material so far has not really concerned the other 19 rings. Perhaps the upcoming television series will see them take a more prominent role. Are there other questions about the Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's works that you'd want answered? If so, let me know down in the comments below. And while you're down there, don't forget to like if you enjoyed this and subscribe for more lore and explanation videos in the future. And also remember to ring the bell so you get notified of all of my uploads, and to please the all-powerful YouTube algorithm. It is watching us all, just like Sauron. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.